Randy Thompson walked out of the conference room without looking back. No argument, no pleading, just a man who already knew the answer before the door swung shut behind him. The lobby was all glass and cold light, the kind of place that made a person feel small on purpose. He kept his eyes forward and his hands steady at his sides. Then the elevator dinged, and someone called his name. Not from behind a desk, but from across the entire floor. He turned. Evelyn Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, was walking straight toward him. Randy Thompson had been running on 4 hours of sleep for the better part of 2 years. Not because he couldn't wind down, but because the math of his life didn't leave room for more. The night shift at Whitmore Enterprises started at 11 and ran until 7 in the morning, mopping floors, emptying bins, wiping down the glass walls of a building that felt like it belonged to a different species of human being entirely. He clocked out before the executives arrived, which suited everyone just fine. He was 35 years old and carried the kind of tired that didn't go away with rest. His wife, Carol, had been gone for 18 months, a car accident on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that had no business changing everything. What she left behind was a son, a stack of medical bills, and a silence in their apartment that Randy had slowly taught himself to stop noticing. He didn't have the luxury of grief. He had a schedule, and the schedule was the only thing holding the shape of his life together. His son Elijah had asthma, the chronic kind that didn't stay manageable without the right medication. The inhalers alone cost more than Randy wanted to calculate, and without health insurance, every bad week was a decision. How serious is this? And can they get through it without a hospital visit? Most mornings when Randy came home from his shift, the first thing he checked wasn't his phone or the fridge. It was the medicine cabinet. That was the rhythm his life had settled into. Not ambition, not forward momentum. Just damage control, repeated daily until further notice. Whitmore Enterprises occupied the top 12 floors of a downtown high-rise in the middle of the city. Randy worked the lower maintenance wing, the part of the building that the company's promotional materials never photographed. He knew the place the way a person knows somewhere they weren't meant to belong. Every freight elevator, every supply closet, every section of hallway where the overhead lights buzzed a half-second longer than they should. He did his work well, kept to himself, and gave management no reason to remember his name. That was the arrangement, unspoken, mutually understood, perfectly stable. It was a Thursday night, sometime past 2 in the morning, when the flyer changed things. He'd been clearing a recycling bin near the HR corridor, one of those small, unremarkable tasks that put him in corners of the building he usually moved through quickly, when a single sheet of paper slid out and landed flat on the tile floor in front of him. He almost stepped around it, almost kept pushing the cart and let the cleaning crew handle it in the morning. But 2 words stopped him before he could look away. Health insurance. He picked up the sheet. The posting was for a customer relations associate position. Day shift, full benefits package, a base salary that was nearly double what he earned on the night crew. The role had been listed internally 3 days prior, and the application window closed in 1 week. Randy stood in that empty corridor under the fluorescent hum and read the entire page twice, slowly, the way a person reads something they're afraid to misunderstand. Then he folded the sheet carefully, slid it into his back pocket, and finished his shift without mentioning it to a single person. On the bus ride home, he made himself not think about it too directly, because thinking too directly about something like this was exactly how a person set himself up to fall. He understood the shape of the situation. He had a significant gap in his employment history from before Whitmore. 2 years of caregiving that didn't translate cleanly to a resume. He had a community college education he hadn't completed. He had no professional references that would carry weight in a building like this one. The people who landed positions like that, day shift, full benefits, a desk, and a company phone, they didn't come from where Randy came from. He understood this the way you understand the rules of a system you've been living inside long enough to stop being surprised by it. But then he got home, and he sat down at the kitchen table in the pale gray light of early morning, and he found a small folded note that his son had left on the counter before going to sleep. The handwriting was uneven at the edges, the paper torn from a notebook. Randy read it once. Then he read it again, more slowly. It wasn't long. It wasn't written to be dramatic. But it said the thing, the exact thing, that Randy had been carefully not saying to himself for a year and a half. And reading it in someone else's hand, someone who had no idea how much weight those words actually carried, made it impossible to fold back up and put away. He sat at that table for a long time without moving. He submitted the application before sunrise. He didn't tell anyone he'd done it. He closed the laptop afterward and made himself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window and tried to feel like a man who had simply done a reasonable, ordinary thing. He wasn't entirely successful, but the application was in, and that was the part he held on to. The 6 days that followed had the quality of all waiting, not calm, just suspended. Randy went to work each night, completed his rounds, came home. He looked up common customer relations interview questions at 1 in the morning and ran through answers in his head while he worked. He thought about what to wear, which became its own quiet problem. He owned dress clothes, but they were the ones he'd bought for Carol's funeral, and putting them on for a job interview felt like something he didn't have the right word for yet. He wore them anyway. There was no other option, and sentiment wasn't something his budget had room for. The night before the interview, he sat at the same kitchen table and went through everything he'd prepared. He knew the company, not from a brochure, but from 2 years of working inside its walls before anyone else arrived. He knew its culture, its pace, its priorities. He could speak to that honestly. The employment gap was explainable. He had been caring for his family following a loss, which was the truth, and the truth was the cleanest answer he had. He rehearsed it until it came out even and steady, without apology and without performance. He told himself he was ready. By the time he went to sleep, he almost believed it. The morning of the interview, Randy arrived earlier than necessary. He came through the front entrance for the first time since he'd started working at Whitmore. Not the maintenance door on the east side, not the loading dock, but the main glass doors that opened into the lobby. The security guard at the front desk looked at him the way people look at someone who appears to be in the wrong place, and Randy held up his phone with the appointment confirmation and said he had a 9 o'clock with HR. The guard checked the screen, checked his face, and waved him through without a word. Randy crossed the lobby, pressed the elevator button for the 7th floor, and kept his eyes on the numbers the entire ride up. He had worked inside this building for 2 years. He knew the layout of every floor below the executive level. He had cleaned the glass and polished the handles and emptied the wastebaskets of this exact elevator bank more times than he could count. And yet, standing here in his dead wife's funeral clothes, waiting to be assessed by a panel of people who had never once registered his presence, he felt like a man walking into a place he had never been before. The elevator opened. He straightened his jacket. He walked forward. The 7th floor of Whitmore Enterprises looked exactly the way Randy had always assumed it did from the outside. Clean lines, low noise, the kind of deliberate calm that cost money to maintain. A receptionist directed him to a waiting area near the end of a hallway. 2 chairs, a low table, a potted plant that was either real or a very good imitation. He sat down and kept his back straight and his hands folded on his knee, and he watched the minute hand on the wall clock move in the particular slow way that clocks move when a person has nowhere else to direct their attention. 2 other candidates had been called in before him. Randy noticed them when they walked out, both younger, both in suits that fit differently from his, both carrying the particular ease of people accustomed to this floor. He didn't spend long studying them. There was nothing useful in that direction. At 9:17, a woman from HR opened the door and called his name with the flat efficiency of someone who had done it 30 times already that week, and Randy stood up, straightened his jacket once, and walked in. The room was a standard conference setup, a long table, 3 chairs on one side, one on the other. 2 HR representatives sat at the far end with folders and laptops. At the center sat a man named Derek Sloan, whose name Randy caught from the placard near his water glass. Sloan was the department head for customer relations, mid-50s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore authority the way other people wore a watch, as a signal, not a necessity. He glanced up when Randy entered and looked back down at the folder in front of him in the same motion, as if completing a single unbroken action. Randy sat down, introduced himself, and said he was glad to be there. Sloan nodded without looking up again. One of the HR representatives, a woman named Patricia, according to her lanyard, smiled with professional courtesy and explained how the interview would proceed. Randy followed along and kept his breathing even. The first several questions were standard. Randy answered them honestly and with the level of specificity he'd rehearsed. What drew him to customer relations, how he handled difficult conversations, how he prioritized competing demands in a fast-moving environment. He gave real answers, not performance. He'd decided that much the night before. If there was a version of this that worked, it would work on what was actually true about him, not on what he could construct to seem more palatable. Then Sloan spoke for the first time directly to Randy, and the tone shifted in a way that was hard to name immediately, but impossible to miss. "Your current role with the company," Sloan said, reading from the folder rather than looking at Randy, "is listed as maintenance staff, night shift." He said it the way someone reads an address that turns out to be in a neighborhood they weren't expecting. "That's quite a pivot you're looking to make here." Randy said it was, and explained that his experience with the building, its operations, and its culture gave him a perspective on client-facing work that was harder to teach than technical skills. He said it calmly, without apology. Sloan set the folder down and looked at him for the first time since he'd walked in. "There's also a 2-year gap here, prior to your time with Whitmore." Randy explained that he had been managing a family situation following a significant personal loss, caregiving responsibilities that had kept him out of the formal workforce for a period, but had required exactly the kind of sustained problem-solving and composure that the role demanded. He kept the personal detail brief. He wasn't there to ask for sympathy. He was there to make a case. What came next wasn't a question. It was framed like one, but it wasn't. Sloan leaned back slightly in his chair and said, "I want to be transparent with you, Mr. Thompson. This position interfaces directly with our top-tier client accounts. We're talking about relationships worth several $1,000,000 annually to this company. The candidates we're considering typically have a minimum of 5 years in client-facing roles, ideally in a corporate environment." He let that sit in the air for a moment before adding, "I want to make sure you understand the level of the position you've applied for." The HR representative next to him kept her expression neutral and her eyes on her screen. Randy understood. Not just what Sloan was saying, but what he wasn't saying. And the gap between those two things was wide enough to drive through. He had heard that kind of language before, the kind that wraps a conclusion inside the shape of a conversation, that makes a decision sound like an ongoing assessment. He knew where this was going, and he knew it had probably been going there since Sloan saw his title on the application. The room had made up its mind before Randy walked into it. He could have pushed back. He had the answers prepared. He had the logic, the articulation, and the genuine substance to argue his case further. But something in that moment made him stop. Not defeat, not embarrassment. Something quieter and more deliberate. He recognized that continuing would require him to perform for an audience that had already left, and he wasn't willing to do that. Not in this building, not in these clothes, Not with everything he'd already put into just getting to this chair. He had his dignity, and it was one of the few things in his life that hadn't cost him anything yet. Randy thanked Sloan and both HR representatives by name. He said he appreciated their time, and that he understood the scope of the role clearly. Then he stood up, pushed the chair back neatly, and walked to the door. Not quickly, not slowly, just forward. He heard one of the HR representatives say something behind him, a soft, uncertain syllable, the beginning of a word that didn't finish before he was already through the door. He crossed the hallway, past the waiting area with its empty chairs, and rode the elevator back down to the lobby. The whole descent took less than a minute, but something had shifted inside it that he couldn't immediately account for. He felt, not light exactly, but clean. Like he had refused to let the thing that happened in that room be the thing that defined the morning. He crossed the lobby, pushed through the main glass doors, and walked out into the open air. He had made it about 40 feet down the sidewalk when he heard the doors open behind him, and then a voice, direct, unhurried, and entirely uninterested in being ignored, cut through the ambient noise of the street and said his name. "Mr. Thompson." Randy turned. Evelyn Whitmore stood just outside the entrance to her own building in a charcoal blazer, no jacket, no entourage, like a person who had simply decided to step outside and had enough authority to make the world accommodate that decision without ceremony. She was in her late 50s, with the kind of composed expression that didn't read as cold so much as deliberate. Someone who had trained themselves to be precise with what their face communicated, and who gave very little away by accident. Randy recognized her. The company's leadership portraits lined the executive corridor on the 12th floor, and he had cleaned that hallway enough times to know every face. "I'd like a few minutes," she said, and it wasn't quite a question, but wasn't quite a command either. It landed somewhere between them, an offer that assumed he was reasonable enough to accept it. Randy stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning air and studied her for a moment. He had nothing left to lose from this conversation, and that was a kind of freedom he hadn't expected to feel today. He said, "All right." She didn't take him back inside the building right away. She stood where she was and looked at him with the focused attention of someone reviewing a document they've already read once and want to read again more carefully. "I was in the building last Thursday," she said. "Late, around midnight. I came down from 12 to get something from the operations office." Randy knew the route. He'd mopped that hallway himself. "I saw you with the security guard, Marcus, at the east end of the building. He was having some kind of episode. Looked like his blood pressure. You sat with him on the floor for almost 20 minutes until the paramedics arrived. You talked to him the entire time. You had the presence of mind to call it in and then stay." She said all of this evenly, as if reading back a log entry. "You didn't make it a scene. You didn't wait for someone else to take over. You just handled it." Randy remembered that night. Marcus had gone pale and unsteady near the supply corridor, and Randy had lowered him to the floor and kept him calm and made sure he didn't try to stand back up before the medics got there. It hadn't seemed like a remarkable thing at the time. It had seemed like the only reasonable thing to do. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone afterward, and as far as he knew, Marcus was back at his post 4 days later. "He was okay," Randy said. "I just made sure he didn't fall." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. "What happened in that interview room this morning? I'm aware of how those conversations go when Derek Sloan is running them. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm also not here to apologize on behalf of a process that had a predictable outcome." She said it with the straightforward clarity of someone who had long since stopped cushioning things unnecessarily. "I'm here because I make decisions about people for a living, and what I watched last Thursday told me something about who you are, that a resume and a panel interview are not especially good at capturing." Randy looked back at the building, the glass front, the lobby. The 7th floor, somewhere behind and above him, where a folder with his name on it was probably already closed. He thought about the note on his kitchen counter that morning, still there, the one he'd read before putting on his jacket. He thought about what it would mean to walk away from this sidewalk right now. Not the failed interview, but this moment, this particular offer from this particular person. He thought about the medicine cabinet at home, and the math that governed his life, and the fact that he was 35 years old and still capable of choosing what happened next. "What are you proposing exactly?" he said. Evelyn told him. Not a customer relations associate position, something structured differently. A client support role that reported to her office directly, with a probationary period of 60 days and a full benefits package from day one. It would require him to work at a level he hadn't operated at formally before. It would require him to prove something to a building full of people who had spent 2 years looking straight through him. It wasn't a comfortable offer. It was a real one. Randy stood with the wind coming off the street and the sound of the city moving around them, and thought about what it meant to say yes to something that wasn't safe. He had been safe for 2 years. Safe and exhausted, and slowly running out of options that weren't emergencies. He thought about walking away, about his dignity, about what it would cost to go back into that building and face the same floor that had just dismissed him. He thought about Elijah's inhaler and the bill from the clinic 3 months ago that he still hadn't fully paid, and the look on his son's face on the mornings when Randy came home from the night shift and they had exactly 40 minutes together before school. He made the decision the way he made most decisions now, not by weighing every angle until certainty arrived, because certainty didn't arrive anymore. He made it by asking himself which choice he could still live with at the end of a bad day. The answer was the same one it had been every time since Carol died. He would move forward, even when forward was the harder direction. 60 days, he said. I'll take it. Evelyn gave a single nod, the kind that meant the conversation was settled, and they could both stop standing in the cold. Come back inside, she said. There's paperwork. Randy turned and walked back toward the main doors of Whitmore Enterprises, not the maintenance entrance on the east side, not the loading dock. The front. The same doors he'd walked out of less than 10 minutes ago. He pushed them open and stepped back in. The paperwork took the better part of an hour. An HR coordinator Randy hadn't met before walked him through the offer documents in a small room on the 4th floor. Benefits enrollment, start date, reporting structure. His new position was titled Client Support Specialist, and it sat one level below the executive floor in the organizational chart, but reported directly to Evelyn Whitmore's office, which meant it existed in a category the building hadn't quite figured out how to classify yet. He signed where he was told to sign and kept his face neutral throughout, because the alternative was showing how much his hands wanted to shake. He started the following Monday. The role came with a workspace on the 9th floor, an open plan area shared with a team of 6 account managers and 2 senior client liaisons. Randy arrived at 7:55 in the morning, wearing a shirt and tie he'd bought over the weekend at a department store on clearance, and he found his desk in the corner nearest the window, already set up with a company laptop and a phone extension printed on a small card. He sat down, logged in, and began reading through the client files Evelyn's assistant had sent him the previous Friday. He could feel the attention on him from across the room without anyone saying a word. The account managers on his floor were professionals in the truest sense, composed, efficient, and entirely capable of making a person feel unwelcome without doing anything technically wrong. No one was hostile. No one said anything direct. But the sideways awareness that followed Randy through his first week had a texture to it that was familiar in a way he didn't enjoy recognizing. He'd been the wrong person in the right building before. He knew the weight of that particular kind of attention. He absorbed it without comment and did his work. His direct supervisor on the floor, a senior liaison named Carl Briggs, mid-40s, with the clipped manner of someone who had been disappointed by surprises before, had been visibly unmoved by Randy's arrival. Briggs hadn't said anything pointed, but he assigned Randy the low-priority accounts in the first 2 weeks, the ones with minimal client interaction and no meaningful stakes. It was the professional equivalent of being handed a broom. Randy completed every task without complaint, responded to every client communication within the hour, and produced clean, clear documentation that required no revision. He couldn't control what Briggs thought of him. He could control the work. By the end of the 3rd week, the scrutiny had shifted slightly. Less ambient hostility, more watchful uncertainty. A few of the account managers had started saying good morning without being greeted first. One of them, a younger woman named Diane, had stopped by his desk on a Thursday afternoon to ask how he formatted a particular type of client summary, because she'd seen one of his and thought the structure was cleaner than the template they'd been using. Randy showed her. It wasn't a turning point. It was just a moment, one of the small ones that accumulate over time into something larger that doesn't have a name yet. Then came the Caldwell situation. Caldwell Industries was Whitmore Enterprises' 3rd largest account, a logistics firm that had been a client for 11 years and represented a contract worth close to $4 million annually. The account manager assigned to Caldwell, a veteran named Tom Heller, had suffered a family emergency on a Wednesday night and was unreachable by Thursday morning when Caldwell's regional director, a man named Arthur Brennan, called the main line in a state of controlled fury. Brennan had discovered a billing discrepancy that had apparently been building across 3 consecutive quarters, one that, if unresolved by end of business Friday, would give Caldwell legal grounds to exit the contract without penalty and take their business to a competitor who had been quietly circling for months. Carl Briggs took the first call and came off it looking like a man who had just been handed a problem with no good options. Heller was unreachable. The 2 senior liaisons who might have stepped in were both off-site at a client summit in another state. The Caldwell files were complex, the timeline was compressed, and Brennan had made very clear that he had no interest in speaking to anyone who wasn't prepared to engage with the substance of the dispute immediately and with full knowledge of the account history. Briggs stood in the middle of the floor with the kind of expression that precedes a decision no one wants to make, and his eyes moved across the room and landed on Randy. Not because Randy was his first choice, because Randy had read every client file Evelyn's assistant had sent him, including Caldwell's, during his first week, when the low-priority assignments had left him with time, and he'd used it the way he used every stretch of open time, to learn everything he could about the environment he was operating in. "Thompson," Briggs said, "how much of the Caldwell file do you actually know?" Randy told him which quarters he'd reviewed, which billing structures he'd cross-referenced against the service agreement addendums, and what he'd noted as potential inconsistencies when he first went through the documentation. Briggs stared at him for a moment, with an expression that had no clear category. Then he said, "Brennan wants a call back in 45 minutes. You're taking it." Randy pulled up the full Caldwell account on his screen, went back through the 3 disputed quarters with a precision that came from having nothing to prove and nowhere to rush, and identified the root of the problem within 20 minutes. It wasn't fraud, and it wasn't negligence. It was a compounding misapplication of a service tier adjustment that had been implemented 14 months prior and never properly reconciled against Caldwell's legacy rate structure. The error was real. The amount in dispute was just under $60,000 across the 3 quarters. It was fixable, and Randy knew exactly how to explain it, in language that addressed Brennan's actual concern, which wasn't the money. It was the sense that no one at Whitmore had been paying attention. He took the call at his desk, with Briggs standing 3 feet away, listening from the other side of a half partition. Brennan came on the line already taut, already positioned for confrontation, and Randy let him finish before saying anything. He introduced himself by name and role, acknowledged the discrepancy without minimizing it, and then walked Brennan through the specific mechanism of how it had occurred, not in defensive language, but in the clear, explanatory tone of someone who understood both the problem and the account holder's position well enough to take them seriously. He referenced specific line items by quarter. He used Caldwell's own terminology from their service agreement. He did not apologize in the abstract. He apologized for the specific failure, named it accurately, and then explained what the correction would look like and what timeline Whitmore could commit to for its resolution. Brennan's tone changed somewhere in the middle of that explanation. Not dramatically, not warmly, but in the way a person's voice changes when they realize they're being heard by someone who actually knows what they're talking about. By the end of the call, Brennan had agreed to hold the contract review pending the corrected billing reconciliation and had asked, not demanded, asked, for Randy to be his point of contact going forward while Heller was out. Randy said he would handle it personally. After the call ended, he drafted the reconciliation memo, had it reviewed by compliance, and sent it to Brennan's office before 4 in the afternoon. Briggs didn't say much. He stood near Randy's desk after the call wrapped and looked at the screen for a moment, then looked at Randy, then said, "Good call." That was the entirety of it. Coming from Briggs, it carried more weight than a longer sentence would have. Word moved through the 9th floor the way it always does in a closed office environment, sideways and without announcement. By Friday morning, the ambient quality of the room had shifted in a way Randy could feel, but not quantify. People didn't stop treating him as an outsider overnight. That wasn't how it worked. But the particular watchfulness that had followed him since his first day had changed its character, from the kind that waits for a mistake to the kind that simply pays attention. He understood the difference, and he chose not to make too much of it. One call, one crisis managed correctly. It was one data point. He intended to produce more. The 60-day probationary period ended on a Tuesday. Evelyn's assistant sent him a calendar invite for a brief meeting that afternoon, and Randy arrived at the executive floor, the 12th, for the first time as someone who had been asked to be there rather than as someone running a mop along its hallways. Evelyn was at her desk when he came in, and she gestured to the chair across from her with the same economy of motion she seemed to apply to everything. She told him his probation was complete, his position was being made permanent, and his salary would be adjusted to reflect the full-grade compensation for the role. She also said that based on Brennan's direct feedback, Caldwell Industries had agreed to a 2-year contract extension, the longest they had signed in the account's history. Randy absorbed all of this without performing surprise. He said he was glad the Caldwell situation had resolved well. Evelyn looked at him across the desk and said, "It resolved well because you knew the account, and you respected the client's concern enough to address it directly. That's not a skill I can train into someone. Either a person has it, or they don't." She wasn't one for longer speeches than that. Neither was he. The commute home that evening was the same bus route Randy had taken every morning after the night shift for 2 years, but in the opposite direction and in daylight. And the difference was something he felt in a way that didn't have a precise name. He got home at 5:30 in the afternoon. He made dinner. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd read his son's note, the same one where he'd filed the application before sunrise. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, he wasn't calculating anything. Not the next bill, not the medication cost, not the gap between what he earned and what the month required. He was just sitting. The math had changed. The insurance card had come in the mail during his 2nd week on the job. He'd stood at the mailbox and held it in both hands for a moment before putting it in his wallet. It was a small piece of laminated plastic, and it represented a stability he hadn't been able to give his son since Carol died. He'd scheduled Elijah's follow-up appointment with the pulmonologist the same afternoon, the one they'd postponed 3 times because of cost. The doctor adjusted the medication plan, and the bad weeks became less frequent. That was the change that mattered most, more than the salary or the title or the contract extension. That was the one Randy carried with him into every morning. He wasn't healed from the 18 months that had come before. He didn't think about it in those terms. What he understood was that something in the shape of his life had shifted, not because luck had finally gone his way, and not because a powerful person had rescued him. It had shifted because on a Thursday night at 2 a.m, he had stopped in a corridor and helped a man who was having a bad moment, without expecting anything from it, and without making it mean more than it was. He had done the decent thing when no one was watching, in the part of the building where no one thought to look. And it had turned out that someone was watching after all, not to reward him, but to recognize something that was already there. The note from his son was still on the kitchen counter. Randy had never moved it. He looked at it sometimes in the morning before he left for work. The uneven handwriting, the torn notebook edge, the particular way it said exactly the thing he'd needed to hear in the exact moment he'd needed to hear it. It hadn't solved anything on its own, but it had been the thing that got him to the elevator, to the 7th floor, to the sidewalk, to the front doors. And sometimes the only job a moment needs to do is get you to take the next step. Everything else is what you do with it after.